In this video, we're going to learn how to evaluate trig functions at any angle. So up here, we're going to write the steps, but as we do that, we're going to solve a problem just so you can follow along. So say you're given something like sine of 210 degrees, and you're asked to figure out what that value is. Now, instead of plugging into your calculator where you might get an answer that is an approximation because there are square roots involved, we're going to solve this by hand. So the first step is to find the reference angle. So we learned last time that the reference angle is the distance from the x-axis. So in this case, we're going to figure out, first off, where 210 degrees is. So I know if I go around, I'm at 90, I'm at 180. If I keep going one more quadrant, I'm at 270. So that's not quite what I want. So I'm at 210. So somewhere around here, you don't have to be perfectly exact, but as long as you get the right quadrant, you're good to go. So here's 210 degrees. And what we're going to do is figure out the reference angle. So the reference angle is the distance from this x-axis. So we know this x-axis is 180. So how far apart is 180 from 210? Well, that's going to be 30 degrees. So 30 degrees is our reference angle. What we're going to do next is evaluate the function at the reference angle. So our reference angle is 30, so we're going to figure out what sine of 30 is. And now here's where that table comes into play, where we have these memorized for 30, 45, and 60. So we know the sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. But remember, 30 degrees is somewhere over here. So we are in a different quadrant, and we learned last time that the quadrants are positive and negative for trig functions based on which quadrant it is. So that's how in the third step, we're going to determine the sign, positive or negative. So remember, we have this little chart that I always draw out: all positive, sine positive, tangents positive, and cosine. You can remember, all students take calculus to remember that. So in this case, we're in the third quadrant, and in the third quadrant, only tangent is positive, so sine is going to be negative. And now sometimes we have to do one more step. So our last step is to flip the fraction if necessary. And what that means is, not unnecessary, if necessary. So we remember we have those three extra functions. So we have cosecant of theta, secant of theta, and cotangent of theta. And if it's one of those, we have to flip the fraction. In this case, we're just working with sine, so we don't have to flip. So finally, we kind of combine everything we know. So our final answer is actually negative 1/2. So what's really cool about reference angles is that they have the same value as the function, except it might differ by positive or negative. So if you know the reference angle, you kind of know the value of the function at that point. It's just you have to determine the sign, and you have to flip it if necessary. So let's go ahead and try two more, just so we really understand this. So in this next one, let's try to figure out cotangent of negative 120 degrees. So remember, negative 120 is going to go the opposite direction. So we always kind of start at this x-axis, and then if we go here, it's negative 190. So here about is negative 120. Remember, if I kept going, I would get to negative 180. So this reference angle is going to be right here. That angle is the difference between negative 180 and negative 120. So that's going to be 60 degrees. Next up, we're going to evaluate the function at that reference angle. But we don't have these funky three like cosecant, secant, and cotangent memorized. So we only have tangent memorized, right? So tangent of that reference angle 60, if you have this chart memorized, which you should kind of start getting familiar with the more you do these problems, tangent of 60 we know is square root of 3. Next up, we ask, in this quadrant that we're in, is tangent positive or negative? Well, if you remember, all students take calculus in this third quadrant, tangent is positive. So cotangent's also positive. And last up, since we're working with cotangent, we have to remember to flip. So we have square root of 3, and remember that's really square root of 3 over 1. Now we flip, and we get 1 over square root of 3. We can't leave our answer with a square root in the denominator. We have to remember to rationalize. If you remember back to our radicals unit, you rationalize by multiplying by the square root in the denominator. So now this is square root of 3 over 3, because if you remember, a square root of x times itself is just x. So now here's our final answer, and it's positive. So our final answer, cotangent of negative 120 after all that, is square root of 3 over 3. Let's try one more. Let's try secant of 135 degrees. Let's first figure out where 135 degrees is. I know if I go here, I'm at 90. If I go here, I'm too far because that's 180. So instead, I'm just going to go a little bit. This is 135 degrees. Remember, if I get to the x-axis, that's 180. So the difference is our reference angle. So right here is our reference angle. That reference angle is 45 degrees. So now I'm going to figure out cosine of 45 degrees because I don't know secant really. So cosine of 45 degrees is square root of 2 over 2. But remember, 45 degrees is right here. And I really want it to be over here. So what I'm going to do is figure out in this quadrant, is cosine positive or negative? Well, all students take calculus in this quadrant. Sine is only positive, so cosine is negative. And now my last step, I have to remember to flip because I'm working with secant. So flip if necessary for those three functions. So square root of 2 over 2. If I flip this, that's 2 over square root of 2. And then I have to rationalize. So I'm going to multiply by square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2. So 2 square root of 2 over 2. The 2's cancel, so I'm left with square root of 2. And remember, it was negative. So my final answer is negative square root of 2. So there's a lot to remember in these problems. But notice, even though it says determine the trig function at any angle, the only reference angles that you're going to encounter in these problems is either going to be 30, 45, or 60. So if you figure out a number that's other than that for the reference angle, it probably is not right, or you're not going to be able to figure it out by hand.